19th century charitable organization. Our vision is to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. I'm Peggy McGrath, a member of the Science Program Committee, and this season we have scheduled 30 programs as part of our enrichment series because it is our mission to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing of our landmark building. The series is focused on art, literature, music, science, and social science. Today's title is From 5,000 Years of Eating Bread to Gluten-Free, How Everything is Interconnected. Dr. Warren Porter is a husband, father, biophysical ecologist, and academic and environmental toxicologist. The latter is the study of environmental poisons in our environment. In the last 30 years, he has taught and done research in the field and is at the Art, Death, and Robert Rodell professional of the environmental toxicology. He is he's a professor emeritus in the Department of Integrative Biology at University of Wisconsin in Madison. As a tenured professor, he took numerous undergraduate classes, 52 different ones in 19 different departments. Physically sitting in the class, doing the homework, and taking the exams. Courses included chemical engineering, atmospheric and oceanic sciences, computer science, and even digital 3D art classes. Unbelievable. And he said, and I quote, "If you want to become technically competent, you have to be willing to be an ignoramus." So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Warren Porter.
Thank you very much, Peggy, for that most generous introduction. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, too. I'm really looking forward to the questions that you might have as we go through this talk. I want to first point out that this business of the long history of human consumption of wheat and other grain products is one that looks really solid, but then why in the last decade or so have our diets been forced to change? Why have we suddenly gotten sick? And things are not always immediately intuitively obvious, as one of my high school teachers used to tell me. And it's sort of like old Charlie was driving in the LA freeway just last month. And as he was driving along, his cell phone goes off, and he turns it on, and it's his wife, and she said, Charlie, be careful. There's some idiot on the freeway, and he's driving the wrong way, and I don't want you to get hurt. And he says, what do you mean one? He says, there's hundreds of them. I have a question for you now. As you look at this picture, this is a picture of a field of wheat that's about maybe 2 weeks away from harvest. And what do you notice about that picture? Is there anything in that picture that looks unusual to you? Those tracks that are running down through that field. And this is what's generating that image. This spray rig. Right now, out there, they're within 1 to 2 weeks of harvest, most of the commercial wheat and oats are being sprayed with a compound called Roundup. And we're going to talk about what are the implications of that process that's been allowed to be initiated and to contaminate the basic foods that we consume in the way of grains and also our sugars. Both our beet sugars and our cane sugar go through this same process. I want to talk about how everything is interconnected, as Peggy mentioned, how common pesticide mixtures can modify reproduction, sexual behavior, learning, immune function, and induce chronic diseases. And I'm also going to talk about safe, effective, inexpensive solutions to these problems. The take-home message, just to get you started and oriented, is a little dab will do you. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the 1950s ads for Brill cream, but this was their logo. And you can see them, you can actually get them on web and listen to them and watch them. They're hilarious. There are a lot of them. But and here's the other bottom line thing I would, if you have a chance to ask your legislators to back a process where we stop subsidizing Roundup spraying on sugars and grains before harvest, this would be a huge step forward in eliminating a major problem that has been not really picked up at all by the media. I'm going to ask you two questions, and I'd like you to just simply holler out the answer when I ask it. Here's the first one. Would you willingly eat food that could compromise your health and your lifespan? No. Would you willingly eat food that could randomly flip your genes on or off and pass those genetic changes on to your children and grandchildren? No. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? Well, I want to tell you that Roundup appears to be able to do both of these things according to global experts and data in the open peer-reviewed scientific literature. And this last thing at the very bottom, this URL for Organic Rising Film, will introduce you to these 5 global experts who are real experts on pesticide impacts on health. So, and then in the recording of all of this, and this will be available, and anybody who has any questions in the future about any of this material, please feel free to contact me too. I'm definitely going to be available. Here's a starter for all of this. The Center for Disease Control recently did a study where they looked to see whether or not there was any Roundup in the urine of children and adults. And what they found was that of 650 children tested, 87% of them had detectable levels of glyphosate in their urine, the main ingredient in Roundup. And when they looked at 1,600 urine samples from adults and found 80% had detectable levels of the weed killer. The samples were collected between 2013 and 2014. I might imagine that those numbers might even be larger now. Here's how everything is interconnected and why it's so important that we watch the kinds of foods that go into our mouths. This is derived from some work that we did and published back in 1999, actually. And the left side of this imagery here is a healthy system, and the right side of that drawing is a sick system, I've referred it to. On the left side, there's at the very bottom a triangular series of, or two triangles. One is molecular cellular systems, mass, energy, and nutrients. We had this for that wonderful lunch that we had today. This is what's critical. These cellular molecular systems are driving the organ system functions of the central nervous system, the endocrine or the hormonal system, the immune system. And it's these two triangles here that support, at the individual function level, reproduction, growth, and birth rates, and above that, the community level functions of immigration, emigration, and relative species abundance. Now, one of the things you're going to see is that each one of these three systems is activated by incredibly low concentrations of chemicals, and it doesn't happen at the larger or higher doses, which is where the EPA does their the data that are used by the EPA are collected. And so that's an important thing that's missing. We're also going to talk about your gut and why it is that your gut is so critically important for all three of these systems. They all talk to each other. It's kind of a gigantic coffee clutch, and there's about 60 different chemicals that connect these three organ system functions. And so we're not only interested in what's going on here, but we're very interested in the gene expression, because that's what controls what's going on at the molecular level that's driving all of this. And so when we talk about environmental contaminants or chemicals or pesticides, what they've learned, what they're doing is they're actually hacking that code. And so this whole system here gets subverted. And that means that these systems are being subverted. And so the whole foundation upon which these superstructures rest is being compromised. And now what we need to do is make sure that that doesn't happen. Underneath of all of these systems that keeps us all alive are beneficial soil microorganisms. They are what feed plants. They provide hollows for water, all kinds of great things. But Roundup does one very important thing. It stops what are called aromatic amino acid synthesis processes. These are ring-shaped amino acids, and they have antibiotic effects when you shut off this, because bacteria have to have this. They don't have vitamin pills. They've got to manufacture their own, and if they can't, and that's what Roundup does, it shuts those off and kills them. Not only then does it kill the beneficial soil microorganisms, but if it's in the food you consume, now you're talking about shutting down the very bacteria in your gut, which allow about 70% of your immune function to occur. And so it's vitally important that we protect the bacteria in our gut, because that's 70% of what we're using in our immune system. These triangles here and that gene expression up there, that's what this talk is all about. Those three things, those four things actually. Pardon me. And here's a summary of those three things on the triangle. The rate of birth, rate of autism births, in 1975 it was 1 birth in 5,000 was autistic. By 2014, 1 birth in 68 was autistic. And you can see that as we go through time here, this rate of autism is just going nuts. Right, crazy. And over here, we have for sperm counts. This is human sperm counts up, excuse me, sorry. Way up here, 120 million sperm per milliliter. And a milliliter is about the size of a sugar cube. Cubic centimeter. Anyway, way back in 1992, Elizabeth Carlson and Niels Skakebak in Denmark noticed that the sperm count was really dropping in Denmark, and they wondered if it was a global thing. Well, it turned out when they got into the literature that all these yellow dots here were data that they discovered that the human sperm count was declining. And so a lot of people said, nonsense, it can't be possible. And so a lot of people jumped into this, and we got more data from Paris and from Denmark, and everybody was showing that sperm was declining 2 to 3% per year. In 2017, here it is, 2017, Levine and his colleagues got into it to see how we were doing, and now we're down to here. We're not only losing sperm counts, but we are also declining in our percent of normal sperm, because back in 1980, there were in Helsinki, Finland, 50% of the sperm are normal. 10 years later, 25% of the sperm are normal. So we're getting to sperm with no heads, or sperm with no tails, or sperm with 2 tails, and it just keeps going round and round. That was a lot of problem. And then finally over here, the immune system. Infectious diseases from 1950 to 2000 have been going down. We've been very effective with various kinds of vaccines. While at the same time, everything was coming down for infectious diseases, the chronic diseases were going up like crazy. Wow, that's a problem. We'll talk about that more, why. Now, let's just start with Roundup, glyphosate. I have a colleague, Dr. Paul Winchester, who is the head of neonatology in Indiana, and he got into looking at how in the heck whether or not glyphosate exposure in early pregnancy might impact on fetal growth or any other aspect of its development. And so they went and they found a lot of women in their first trimester, and wanted to find out whether or not Roundup might be impacting on that capacity. And before we get into that, I want to point out that Roundup is actually a mixture. The active ingredient is glyphosate, but then there are also solvents and surfactants in it. And the reason that they have them is because they've got to get it into the body, and so they've got to dissolve it through the skin or through the lung surface. And then once you get it into the body and into the circulation, you've got to get it out of the blood and into the cells. And all the cells have little wax, are made of a waxy substance. It's, well, how shall I say this? Have you ever thought about why you don't dissolve when you step into the shower? You don't. Take a look at your skin next time you're in the shower and watch how the water beads up on your skin like a nice wax car. That's what pesticides have to do. They have to get across that waxy barrier, and that's what those solvents and surfactants are all about. And so these mixes are very important for the function of this thing. Well, excuse me, sorry, I apologize for this cough. Turns out that when they got these women, the infant birth weight percentile is what we want to be looking at in the first trimester. And the women here, we're looking, each dot here is a pair, as a mom and her fetus or her baby. There are 155 of these things here. And the data here are plotted in terms of percent, or the amount of glyphosate in parts per billion, from 1 part per billion to 10 parts per billion, basically. And you can see that the average weight of the fetus, of the baby that's born, as you go from one part per billion more, you're getting a 4% decline in the average percentile of the birth weight of the child. And that's important because as that birth weight goes down, the neonatal intensive care unit admission risk is going up. You get smaller heads and development, which usually leads to a smaller head development, a little bit of a brain development, and also the child almost always is going to be more obese. All of those things simply related to the child coming out with a smaller birth weight. Now, everybody would say, who's in the pesticide industry, well, this is just a little bit, just a little dab. It shouldn't do you much. But a really, really brilliant man by the name of Robin Mesnagi. He's a faculty person over in the UK in London. And he and a whole suite of colleagues decided to test this idea that very low dose over long periods of time, and the question was, is it biologically active? So the dose they used was 100 parts per trillion drinking water. A part per trillion, you'd imagine, would be a pool, a swimming pool, about roughly the size of this room, 6 feet deep. And in that pool of very pure water, you put a single drop of liquid. That's a part per trillion, roughly. Incredibly tiny concentrations. They gave that dosage once a day in the drinking water of rats. It changed 4,224 liver transcript clusters, 4,447 liver transplant clusters. What was important there? Because those transcript clusters were changing genes that allowed the cells to take their messenger RNA, which is the messenger from the gene to making the protein. So this is the translation part, and you've got to splice those together, right? Because if you don't, the protein structure is going to be off, the enzyme won't work, and you have changed a biochemical pathway. The chromosome structure itself, the chromosomes that contain all the genes, they were being affected. There's a little powerhouse of the cell called the mitochondria. In fact, there are millions of them and hundreds of them in every cell. Their membrane structure is crucial to their function And that's how they produce the energy that we use to, how I'm using to stand right here and be able to talk and to see you and to hear you. All of the energy of our body comes from these little structures here. And finally, various metabolic pathways. The genes that were controlling those were also being affected. So that's what was behind these two changes here. In the kidney and the liver, these are the two main detoxification organs in the body. Your liver takes care of the fat-soluble ones typically, and your kidneys take care of the water-soluble ones. That will be important later too. Here are some of the known things that Roundup can do because of its active ingredients, its surfactants, and its solvents. First thing it can do is it can damage the genetic material, your coding for how you live. The universal coding that every living thing on this planet uses to transfer energy from the genes, the genetic information to make that do something meaningful. So altering fetal gene expression means altering their developmental patterns. It means birth defects, for example. It also lowers a chemical, an enzyme called aromatase. And this aromatase is really important because it converts the male sex hormone testosterone into the female hormone estrogen. It's a one-way conversion, only one way going from testosterone to estrogen. We'll talk about this a little more. But it can, if you modify that rate of change, how fast that testosterone is converted to estrogen, you can change the fetal brain and gonad development. So it can change sexual development. It crosses the blood-brain barrier and it alters a key immune responder. It's called TNF-alpha in the brain. I will get into more of these and explain it in a little bit more detail, but I just want to give you a list of some of the things that this one particular herbicide can do. I'm not just picking on Roundup. We'll see that there are other chemicals that can have similar kinds of impacts. But anyway, we know that it shuts down what's called the Shikimate pathway, which is the production of aromatic amino acids, which means that bacteria die when they can't make their necessary essential amino acids. And that's about 70% of the immune functions in the gut. It alters the energy metabolism, the mitochondria, the powerhouses of the cell, and creates oxidative stress. Oxidative stress kills nerves, it alters hormone levels, alters immune function. It's the basis for more than 10 chronic diseases. And it also stimulates a pathway, a metabolic pathway called the retinoic acid pathway. This is when you produce vitamin A, and if you produce too much of it and you're pregnant, your chances of having a fetus with problems is multiplied a lot. Roundup chelates, it ties or robs the body of metal ions that have two positive electric charges, and these include things like calcium, magnesium, zinc, copper. And the significance of that is that calcium and magnesium are critical for DNA gene copying. These ions in general, this whole class of divalent ions in general, are key ingredients for the body's enzymes and its chemical functions. And so we have data now, well-established data from many researchers, showing fundamental modifications of the biochemistry of the cells that affects their ability to function. If you want to look at this some more, you can go to the web and go to the Beyond Pesticides website. That will give you a lot more specifics, a lot more technical information, and more importantly, a lot of human feedback, because if you want to ask questions, Beyond Pesticide is really good at responding to you by email in any way if you want to look at it. And then finally, I just want to remind you again, this Roundup is being used as a pre-harvest desiccant and weed killer. It's used on our cane and our beet sugars, our wheat and our oats, and was in Quaker and General Mills cereals, in every single cereal that was sampled by the Environmental Working Group that did the study way back in 2018. So the evidence is hiding in plain sight. You can go to Google Scholar and just check out Roundup and immune, or Roundup and endocrine, or Roundup and neurological, or Roundup and epigenetics, and just see what's out there in the general scientific literature. So I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail now in each of these three systems, the neurological, the endocrine, and the immune systems. And as I showed you earlier, the U.S. autism birth rates as of 2014 are up to about 1 in 45 births per live birth. And we don't even know, I don't even know what the data are. There aren't any data, I don't know what the data are beyond that time. I also want to show you the data that was reported recently in 2022. And here's the URL. You can go and look it up. This is an article in plain English, but there's also a scientific article to back this up that shows how glyphosate can cross the blood-brain barrier, and once it does, it impacts on a very important pro-inflammatory chemical in the brain, TNF-alpha, and they talk here about the implications for neurodegenerative diseases. I guess one thing I want to point out to you right down here in the bottom is that elevated TNF-alpha is found in many neurodegenerative diseases. Soluble amyloid beta is a precursor to plaques, a classic hallmark of Alzheimer's, and both that one and TNF-alpha are both of these things that are advanced, TNF-alpha and that amyloid plaques, are elevated by Roundup or glyphosate. This was a major important paper that came out. And then finally, to kind of generalize this for neurological things, I want to show you a piece of work that was done back in 1998 by Elizabeth Gillette and a series of her collaborators from Mexico who were also in medical research. This was a very unusual situation. Back in the early mid-1900s, a chemical company got a grant from a charitable foundation in the U.S., and that grant was to improve the economic activity and the agricultural activity in Mexico, and also to assure us of winter fruits and vegetables. And so they got money, a grant, to go in and buy a whole valley, the Yaqui Valley in Sonora, Mexico. And they went in there and they said to the people, the indigenous people who were living there, that they'd like them to work the fields for them. It was going to make them a lot of money. They're going to be really well paid. And by the way, they might be spraying once or twice a week, or maybe once every other week. And that was enough to send half of the population of that valley up the mountains, away from the valley, so they wouldn't be impacted by that. And their cousins, their friends, their relatives stayed behind and began to work the fields. And it wasn't long before the children seemed to be different. And they decided to call in Dr. Gillette and her colleagues to have her assess and have them assess the capacity of these children in terms of their endurance, their capacity to work mental problems, their ability to drop a clothespin in a bottle. And one of the things they also did was they asked them to draw a human figure. Now, my sister Marilyn Kareem here was telling me about this because I was asking her about it, and when she saw these pictures, she was very upset. The children up on the mountains and the foothills, when they were asked to draw a human figure, they drew what you would expect: facial features, digits on the hands and the feet. The children in the valley were asked to do the same thing, and here's what they drew. And I asked Dr. Gillette, aren't you really exaggerating this kind of thing? And she said, no, these are typical. I asked the child who drew this figure, where was the top? And she said, she pointed there. Where's the bottom? She pointed there. These children lost their endurance. They weren't able to jump rope more than 1 or 2 or 3 times, and that was it. Whereas the kids up in the mountains who hadn't been exposed were jumping rope like crazy at this age, and they were doing lots of other things that normal children would do. Now they've grown up. The Teen Valley boys may have memory tissue in their tender breasts. They have very tender breasts as they came into puberty. Teen Valley girls only have fat in their breasts. They will never be able to nurse their babies if they ever have babies. And the children's mothers in the valley had very high rates of breast cancer. So we have to ask, what will be our children's future? And one hint about that is, how much are we spending on remedial education? I can tell you in Madison, Wisconsin, about almost 20 years ago, we were already spending more on remedial education than we were on reading, writing, and arithmetic. Another example, problem number 2, the endocrine system, that sperm count decline. In 1939, just about the start of World War II, our sperm counts were way up, and 60 to 70% of the U.S. males qualified as sperm donors. By 1990, we were down to 6 to 7% of the U.S. males qualify as sperm donors. And you can see where that decline and that tendency to lose capacity to produce sperm, both quantity and quality. And when we get down to about 25 million sperm per ml, we know we will have more deaths and births planet-wide. That's going to happen about 2035 if current trends continue to decline at about 2 to 3% per year. And if we get down to zero fertility, we're looking at, out here, another generation. So it's time that we started doing something about this and getting a pesticide out of our food supply that is capable of changing our sexual development, as I'm going to show you in just a minute. It's time to get moving. By 2012, 1% of the soldiers in Israel, who are the primary sperm donors in Israel, would have qualified, and a year later, that was the first year ever in the U.S. history that we as whites had more deaths than births. By 2017, 1 in 8 couples in our country were having fertility problems. And here is what's so important, and not very many people know about this, that all of us are conceived as bisexual organisms, and we develop that way for the first 3 embryonic months of our existence, until parts per trillion to parts per quadrillion sex hormones, that is the ratio of testosterone to estrogen, are modifying our sexual and our brain development, irrespective of what our genetics is, whether we're genetically female, in quotes, I'm using this loosely, or genetically male, XY, as opposed to an XX sexual chromosome presentation. And critically important, the herbicides Roundup and atrazine can alter the balance of testosterone and estrogen in the fetus because they can cross the placental barrier. And I want to show you just how that works. We start with cholesterol up on the top on the left. And through a series of chemical reactions, we get down here to testosterone. And then here's the critical reaction. Here's the enzyme aromatase that converts testosterone to estrogen. It's a very simple conversion chemically. But if you're getting increasing the flow by increasing the amount of aromatase, which is what the herbicide atrazine does, which is you wind up making more estrogen relative to testosterone, and so when the fetus starts making that decision, now you're lowering sperm production, because with more estrogen, you don't induce as many Sertoli cells, which are the nurse cells that are going to make sperm when they reach puberty. You may also have males or the organism that is being masculinized, you may have both of the sex organs in the body. Mammary tissue may be induced in male breasts, and as has been shown in quite a few pieces of research, mostly by Tamaro and Hayes at Berkeley, changes in sexual orientation. I've cut out a lot of the backup data to allow me to get done with this talk in the proper time zone, but it's something that's really important. And also, if, on the other hand, you've got Roundup present, that tends to shut down aromatase, blocking this flow, and so you have a buildup of testosterone here. And so if you've got a female genotype where it's trying to get to the estrogen production and it's not, instead this is building up, you can generate a situation where the female winds up developing and not able to ovulate or having great difficulty ovulating, symptoms like polycystic ovary syndrome. And we get from soybeans Roundup, and from atrazine we have GMO corn, which has had been treated with atrazine. Now we want to ask, well, what are relevant concentrations of estrogens in humans? Is there any evidence for reproductive impairment? This is one of the slides I used in teaching basic biology to 1,000 students a semester at the UW-Madison. This is a map of time going from the first day of menstruation to the last day of the cycle, 28 days. The ovarian cycle is pictured up here, showing the growing follicle, and as it grows, it makes hormones. It makes estradiol, which is the form of estrogen that is produced during sexual development, or when you're sexually mature. And at this point in time, through this point in time, the concentration of estradiol is about 40 parts per trillion. That's how we're responding to it. And that 40 parts per trillion has impacts on the uterine cycle in terms of whether or not and what it's doing to facilitate the development of the uterine lining, especially in terms of progesterone concentration as well as estradiol. So the follicle is growing, it's producing hormone, the uterus is changing, and it's also having an impact on the brain, the hypothalamus in the brain. It's inhibiting it at 40 parts per trillion. It's inhibiting it from releasing FSH and LH, which later on, as the concentration rises to 400 parts per trillion, because these cells are now a lot more of them than they were at the beginning. Now we're getting a lot more hormone. It completely reverses the way the brain responds to estrogen, and it begins to release a big flush of LH and FSH, the hormones that induce ovulation, and then this concentration drops back down again. But the point that I really want to make here is that opposite effects occur at low versus high estrogen concentrations on the brain. Over these tiny shifts in concentration, we get a completely different response by the neurological tissues in the brain that make these hormones. So we're exquisitely sensitive to really tiny concentrations of chemicals. A little dab will do you. Now I want to talk just a little bit about the developing fetal brain. This is work that Dr. Fred von Saal did at the University of Missouri-Columbia. He's one of the world's top reproductive endocrinologists. And some time ago, he did a series of experiments looking at the production of testosterone relative to estrogen. Now, the uterus of a mouse, this was done in mice, is a bipartite uterus. There's a side here, and we're just looking at the female fetuses relative to the male fetuses. And here it is, male fetuses we're looking at relative to the female fetuses. Now, why is this important? Well, if the ratio of testosterone to estrogen is 10.87 roughly, that's what you get when you've got a female and she's growing up between two female embryos around her. The leakage of the hormone from one embryo to the other is influencing the development of that fetus right there. She will always be the alpha, the top female in the litter. As you increase the amount of testosterone and decrease the amount of estrogen in the ratio, it drops. And this one, here's a female that is surrounded by a male and a female. And then a little bit more, when we have a female surrounded by two males, she's going to be driven to that kind of development by this ratio here. She's always going to be the sort of the most submissive, and she's going to have her own behavioral patterns. On the other side, as you begin to change that ratio even more, now we've got a male between a female and a female, surrounded by two females right here. And we go a little further and we look at a male between a female and a male. And now we've got this ratio here. And then finally down on the bottom here, we've got a male surrounded by two males. And that's the ratio of testosterone to estrogen. And now we have an alpha male. He will always be the top, dominant, most aggressive animal in the litter. And so what this set of experiments did, which is reported in the paper by Laura Vandenberg and 11 other authors, is that sex is not binary. It's shades of gray, influenced by minuscule amounts of hormones and many synthetic chemicals. Now we can ask, might estrogen changes alter human sexual behavior? Now, one of the things we need to realize is that the estrogen receptor is a promiscuous receptor in the sense that it will interact with a lot of different molecules that don't necessarily look like estrogen. For example, flame retardants, plasticizers, non-olphenol, something that makes plastic wrap work really well. It also causes breast cancer, polycystic ovary, PCBs, dioxins, and phthalates. All of these look like estrogen to the body. And so contamination, DDT is another one. And that was started in the early 40s. The production in all of us were exposed to that in one way or another because of the ubiquitous use of DDT. And it had some impacts. Anyway, Bruce McEwen decided to look into the early developmental processes with pesticides, especially estrogenic pesticides. And there's a paragraph in his paper called Psychosexual Differentiation and Diethylstilbestrol, DES. This was a time when they were putting out the dogma that it was a good idea to use some kind of chemical to prevent abortions, spontaneous abortions in moms. So they were giving them this diethylstilbestrol. And what that did was it caused the kids to become different. When it was applied during pregnancy, in studies, he writes, in thus far completed and published, prenatal diethylstilbestrol altered general patterns and measures of behavior in adolescence and adulthood that reduced the formation of heterosexual relationships. These differences could not be explained by sexual dysfunction, such as vaginismus and dyspareunia, which were low in both groups, but rather appear to be due to psychosocial and neuroendocrine factors related to DES exposure. And there are 3 papers that he's referencing to document these changes that were occurring in human development. It also turned out that these kids who were exposed were very much more sensitive to getting cancer and other really nasty long-term diseases. And I had some in my classes when I was teaching. Well, then we, in our laboratory, we began to wonder, can compromised hormone function happen at low levels, and might it affect abortions and resorptions of fetuses? And so we went down to Farm and Fleet and picked up a common lawn chemical mix, which had 2,4-D, Mycoprop, and dicamba, the three structures written there. 2,4-D, by the way, always has two small forms of dioxins, which are one of the most potent estrogens on the planet. They don't break down very easily. And by the way, 2,4-D resistant alfalfa is currently being grown in Montana and fed to beef cattle. So again, an estrogen kind of contaminant in feed if you happen to be feeding them with that kind of growing pattern. These three molecules pictured here have two things in common. They all have this ring-shaped structure, and if it's a ring-shaped structure without anything else on it, it's very fat-soluble. It goes right through your skin in a moment, or right through a cell membrane. But if you also have negatively charged groups, like a chloride group or an acid group, and you'll see it on all of these molecules, that means strongly water-soluble. And what that does is, if having both fat-soluble and water-soluble parts to the molecule gives you the ability to go through any kind of membrane. Well, we did an experiment where we did a lot of animals, made them, got females pregnant, and then used different concentrations of the pesticides, the mixtures. We started with 400 parts per billion, 400,000 parts per billion, here with a very high dose, then 70,000, then 320, then 39 parts per billion. And we compared that to the animals that were not given any chemicals. And here was the typical litter size, anywhere from 12 to 15, and the minimum size was 8 in the litter. And here's a summary of this. And can you tell me which of these concentrations caused the most abortions and resorptions of fetuses? Lowest dose, that's right. This was another example of an inverse dose response. The lower the dose, the greater the effect. And here the immune system. As you will see in a minute, the same kind of a thing going on. On the left again, how well we've done in terms of controlling diseases that you can deal with antibiotics or vaccines. But on the right, going from 1950 to 2000, 1950 to 2000, chronic diseases have been going up like crazy in many different kinds of diseases, varying between type 1 diabetes, asthma, Crohn's disease, MS, multiple sclerosis. Now, it turns out that chronic inflammation, it turns out, is the basis for at least 10 chronic diseases. 30% of the US population are taking daily medications that suppress immune functions. And there's been a lot of controversy as to why we responded to vaccines that are supposed to protect us from COVID, and why are things so different? It appears that there are certain kinds of changes that are taking place in our immune system ability to respond to them. Concentrations. Immune insult is associated with, as I mentioned, with many serious chronic health problems. Dietert down here, way back in 2007, pointed out that what we can expect to see is impacts on asthma and allergic diseases, autoimmunity, infectious diseases, and ineffective vaccine responses, cancer, neurodegenerative disease and neurocognitive loss, cerebral palsy, atherosclerosis, hypotension, and male sterility. Remarkable. Again, a reminder that 30% of the U.S. population are on drugs that have immunosuppressive properties. Now I want to get to the immune-gut connection, because the gut is the home for the bacteria that provide at least 70% of our immune function. What we have here is a paper done by Judy Carmon and her colleagues in Australia, where they fed some pigs GMO foods which were contaminated with various pesticides versus control animals which were given organic feed. And they asked, is there any difference in the internal anatomy of these guts? And it's obvious, of course, that the gut lining here, which is so red, represents inflammation. And inflammation indicates strong immune activity. What's happening is that the boundaries, or the glue that holds cells together, is beginning to be dissolved or relaxed, and the joints and the connections between the cell membranes is now becoming leaky. So material in the gut can now begin to leak out into the bloodstream. And when that happens, this creates an opportunity for bacteria and other substances to escape the gut and enter the bloodstream, where they are recognized as, quote, foreign molecules. Well, why is that important? Because if things are leaking through the gut and they are generating inflammation, then we've got a problem. And the question was, are humans developing leaky guts? And the paper here by Spisak and colleagues, published in 2013 in PLOS, points out that in the abstract that says here, based on the analysis of over 1,000 human samples from 4 independent studies, we show that an unknown mechanism these molecules can enter the human circulation system. In one of the human blood samples, the relative concentration of plant DNA is higher than the human DNA. A really bad, leaky gut. So it's clear that if this kind of inflammation does happen, things can really start getting into the gut body, and inflammation leads to leaky gut, leads to more foreign molecules, which leads to more inflammation, and you've got a positive feedback system where the gut really starts going crazy. At one point, early in our research, we began to wonder whether or not there might be immune suppression from a very common pesticide called aldicarb. And we also began to wonder whether or not there might be some kind of an inverse dose response associated with that. So we took a whole suite of mice. This was a paper by Olson and colleagues back in 1987, where we used 1,000 parts per billion, 100 parts per billion, 10 parts per billion, and 1 part per billion, and then nothing at all. And here was the ability to make antibodies for the animals that were not exposed to this. And you can see what the suppression of the ability to make antibodies was as you drop the concentration of this particular pesticide. It was the first time anybody had shown immune suppression in an inverse dose response condition or concept. And well, we wound up being excommunicated from the EPA once we started to try to publish this stuff. That was a very interesting experience too. Now finally, how about changes in fetal gene expression? Nobody even dreamed that this was possible, that it might be heritable, until a paper by Michael Skinner and his colleagues in 2005 in Science magazine showed that an endocrine disrupting kind of chemical was capable of changing the genetic expression 4 generations down the line. It got embedded into the male sperm and was translated by the male sperm along the germline. And then later papers, he's published several of them, have backed this up and have gone to point of showing that it isn't just something like Roundup, but other chemicals can do the same kind of thing. Now here's another kind of birth defect, a new epidemic from rural areas in Wisconsin and around the country. And what does this picture suggest to you? The genetic control of development has been changed, hasn't it? This is not a normal birth. So how do you control population size? Well, you decrease births, you increase deaths. And what we can do is we can lower the fertility. That'll lower births, decrease births. We can reduce mating success. We can increase birth defects, which is the greatest source of infant mortality. And we can change the fetal gene expression. And we can increase deaths by enhancing aggression, by contaminating the air, food, and water, by compromising the neurological, hormone, immune, and epigenetic functions, none of which are tested collectively in the EPA registration process. And we can alter the metabolome, the biochemical pathways of the organisms, to bugger up their basic fundamental biochemistry. So in summary, what have we learned? Well, the data suggests that we may be sexually assaulting our children in utero, possibly altering their sexual preferences or aborting them prematurely. Virtually no marketed pesticide formulation has ever been registered by the EPA. That means we have no data on formulations. The registrations do not include tests for neurological, endocrine, immune, developmental, or epigenetic DNA methylation tests. No data from collective sensitive tests. Data for registrations come with the companies that make the chemicals a clear conflict of interest. And so the registration data is based on biased data. They will not accept independent studies that are not run by the chemical companies who make the products that they're asking to be registered. And so we have to ask this question: can we afford to raise generations of children that are neurologically, endocrinologically, immunologically, and reproductively impaired? Can we afford to induce chronic, long-term subtle diseases and altered gene expression that may be passed to subsequent generations? So in review, here are the three systems that we looked at: a neurological system, and the hormonal or endocrine system, and the immune system. And how can you protect yourself and your family? There are lots of things you can do to protect yourself and your family. First, if you get clean, organic, or biodynamic food as much as possible, body chemistry responds rapidly to a good or bad diet. Organic food options on campus. I'm still trying to get the UW-Madison to feed our undergraduates and make organic food options available. It's a real challenge, but I think we're getting some progress. Pure filtered water for cooking and drinking. Reverse osmosis is the most thorough, but activated charcoal is good too. Drink plenty of fluids. You excrete water-soluble toxins in your urine, so we have defenses. And also, sweat regularly if you can. You excrete fat-soluble toxins in your sweat. And if you want to replace some of the stuff that Roundup and some of these things are stealing from you, you may want to consider every other day children's vitamin, low value thing, but definitely check with your medical doctor about any kind of supplementation you might want to take. Join and support local, national, and international groups, elected officials working for healthy causes like organic farmer support, clean water and air, justice issues. And here's that bottom line again. See if you can get your legislators to stop subsidizing prophylactic Roundup spraying on sugars and grains just before harvest. It's probably behind the tremendous amount of contamination that we're seeing not only in our foods but in our human beings that are being measured by the CDC. Roundup functions like an antibiotic in the gut, which affects gut bacterial immune functions and has long-term kidney and liver effects at 1,000 parts per trillion doses with chronic exposures in rats. We know all of this. And here, that CDC data, just remembered, I'll just point it out to you again, that at least 80% of us have this stuff in our urine right now. A little dab will do you. And your doctors have likely not been trained in environmental toxicology. So you may be training them. And there's lots of information out there that'll let you do that. And I'm often asked, Warren, don't you think things ought to go faster? They're so slow. And I say, well, it all reminds me of the very clever co-pilot story of Howard Harrison, who was a Vietnam War ace. And after the war, he started flying 747s all over the world. And finally, one year, he got tired of taking the physical every year, which he was passing with no problem. And he says to his boss, he says, boss, I'm just tired of taking this exam every year. I'm all done. I'm not going to take it anymore. And the boss said, well, Howard, he said, you better take that exam, or if you don't, we'll have to ground you and you'll never fly again. And Howard said, oh, all right, I'll take your exam. And so he goes and sails right through the exam until he gets to the very last one, which is the I exam, and he can hardly read the E on the top of the chart. And the doctor looked at me and he said, I know your record, Howard. You have this perfect safety record, this perfect landing patterns. And you're so nearsighted you can't even hardly see the E on my chart. How do you do that? Howard said, Doc, it's easy. He says, I've been flying since I was 14. I get into the cockpit, I get taxi clearance, we taxi down the end of the runway. I orient the plane, we get takeoff clearance, I shove the stick forward and off we go. We get up in the air, I dial the autopilot, the plane flies itself. Get near the airport, get on the glide path, I shove the stick forward and down, down, down we go. And Doc says, I know, Howard, but why don't you crash? He says, Doc, it's easy. Just keep going down and down and down. And when a co-pilot says, Jesus Christ, man, I pull back. Thank you very much.
So if you would raise your hand if you have a question and wait for me to get to you with the microphone. Billy?
The ads on television right now advertise Roundup, and the very last signs, the very last sentence is Roundup may cause cancer. How do they get away with that?
As long as they disclose it, it's okay. As long as they could be killing you, literally, right? I mean, now. And as long as they disclose this may be causing death. You hear that in a lot of ads now these days is, take this medication. One of the causes, side effects may be death, but anyway, they get away with it because it's legal. That's the way the law is written. It's crazy. So you just want to listen carefully.
I'm having a problem making sense of the concept of having a maximum ill effect with smaller and smaller and smaller contaminants. And obviously I'm missing something here, because it means that you would have the greatest effect by doing nothing. And obviously I'm missing something.
That's a very common response. It has been my impression too. The way that receptors work is really complex and is not very well known, actually. But there is a really good paper that explains that process. I didn't go into any of that because it is so intricate. But if you would contact me, I'll give you the reference to that paper. It was published, I think, in 2012 by a suite of people who are the leading world experts in these ways that these chemical reactions work, especially at ultra low doses. And there is a scientific explanation, but it's really intricate, and it would take me a very long time to explain that to you, to this group. But I'm happy to show you that. Yeah, it's not immediately intuitive obvious. Endocrinologists have known it actually since the 1960s. And I was completely ignorant of it when we first ran these experiments. I couldn't believe it. That's why we ran the experiment 4 times. Got the same answer each time. So I thought, it must be real.
Do you believe that if we bought our food at Whole Foods instead of at the Jewel, we would be less contaminated with pesticides or pesticide residue?
That's a great question. I ask myself that every time I go grocery shopping. There is actually quite a bit of work that is done to assure the organic status of foods, but it is not by any means 100% sure. And so you cannot be guaranteed. We don't have any technology where you can just take a cell phone type thing into the grocery store and it goes sniffing around. But that actually is not too far away, because some of the olfactory research now is getting to the point, especially for military purposes, sniffing out munitions and stuff. So they're getting very good at that kind of thing. But it's going to be a while before we have a commercially available thing for consumers. But there is a lot of money being spent on certifying that things are produced organically. And this is why local producers whom you know, or local co-ops or things like that are really, really useful, because there you know whether or not these people are using it. They have been certified, and so this is one reason why a lot of people will argue that it's not really great to have food coming in from overseas, because just recently they took away the requirement that organic foods coming in from overseas need to be certified or examined carefully. And so it's a great way for people to move the pesticide usage out of the country and then have it come back in and not be checked. Yes?
Yes. I'm wondering if everything that you talked about could influence the transgender population, maybe increase it?
I showed you the data. This is a very touchy subject, and we have so much going on now, but there's been so much prejudice against the children who have been changed. This is why I talk about it. I don't necessarily use the best terminology to describe it. My daughter keeps harassing me about, do it better, Dad, you know, and because, but this is a real phenomenon, and it's been shown in all the major classes of vertebrates that you can change their sexual orientation that's independent of their genetic composition by altering those hormones when the embryo starts to make its decision about what am I going to induce and what am I not going to induce during development. I have photos of male frogs trying to copulate with each other, for example, that Tyrone Hayes has from his work at atrazine out at Berkeley. And his funding was compromised by the university because he was getting into this area and disrupting, making the chemical industry very unhappy. And they subsidize a lot of Berkeley's operations. So they're everywhere.
You said that we should contact our legislators. The question I have is whether it's on the state level or federal level where it's being supplemented.
We need them both. We need them both. Some states have a lot more power over what is used, but it's the federal government really that is deciding on the Farm Bill what gets funded and what does not get funded. And it turns out that the amount of money spent on organic agriculture research is 1/100th at least below what is spent on pesticides. And so we need to kind of shift things. The farmers shouldn't be left hanging high and dry. They should be supported, but we need more support into the organic agriculture area.
Roundup has been sued, sometimes successfully. They've lost, they've paid money, and nothing has changed. You want to comment on that?
That's absolutely correct. That Roundup, the company that makes it, has been successfully sued for multi-billions of dollars. And in many cases, there was a specially poignant case in California where a man who came down with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma he won a $20 billion lawsuit, I think. He has yet to see hardly any of that money. They just don't pay. And then trying to sue him again is a massive problem for a poor person who has been a laborer and now he's near death because of exposures that he's had. So it's money talks, and so it's a battle. But the thing that's really going to change this is when people will not buy pesticide-type foods, when they know they're not pesticide foods, and it's going to be market share. We will never have an EPA that is just really in there fighting for us because the EPA is effectively been taken over in a lot of places by industry interests. They've infiltrated many of the committees that make the critical decisions on what is or is not a pesticide. And many of them get their salaries increased or their promotions because they've allowed a lot of pesticides to be registered. And there have been stories in the reporters that specialize in investigative research on this, and I can provide you with some of those references if you want, but it's been documented more than once. Anytime, just email me. My email is very simple, wpporter@wisc.edu, and I'll be happy to respond to your questions.
Yeah, I think here everybody's very disturbed by your report that you've shown here, and at the high risk.
Okay.
The high risk. Yeah, the high risk that it appears that we're all at. What legislation is coming up or looks like might help manage this problem?
There's a lot of efforts to try to introduce legislation that will make it more difficult. The biggest one is just simply trying to get Roundup banned from being used. It is not a necessary thing. And we really need the American public to stand up, especially the moms. I love moms against drunk drivers or mom against this or that. We need a moms against screwing up our kids, or moms against against Roundup or something. I don't know what that name ought to be, but if we can find some women, their history is that they've really elevated all kinds of social agendas, and this in a sense is a social agenda, but it's one that affects our entire existence.
Thank you so much for a very thought-provoking message.
Thank you for your wonderful questions.